going to start today, and usually, with some good news, some really good news. Good news from the Trump administration, nonetheless. And this is something that happened a few weeks ago, but in the flurry of executive orders that the Trump administration has embraced, it's hard to keep track of everything that's being done. But this one is important, and this executive order is important. It's significant. It's not unfortunately as significant as it could be, because that would require, again, legislation, that horrible thing. But it is definitely a step in the right direction, and it could have real ripple effects and ultimately could result in legislation that would make a real difference in Americans' lives. And this is kind of an extension of the other really, really good thing that I think Trump has done through executive order, again, that has not received much press, and that is doing away with affirmative action, which, if you remember, when that executive order passed, I said that it was probably the best thing that Trump was going to do. Well, this is in support of that, if you will, and that is Executive Order 14281, which basically targets the judicial doctrine of disparate impact. That is one more of the effects, you could say unintended effects, but it may be predictable effects of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, what does disparate impact mean? Well, it's a doctrine that came out of a case, a Supreme Court case in 1971 called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. I've talked about this in the past on one of the shows that I did in the past about, after BLM and everything that came out of that, and because it really is the source of the whole equity perspective, the perspective of really systemic racism. The perspective of systemic racism comes as a, long-term consequence of this case. So this is a case in which civil rights groups argued that black voters at a North Carolina utility, that is Duke Power, were not being promoted quickly enough. And Duke Power said, look, we give everybody a test, and the results of this test are that 58% of whites pass the test, only 6% of blacks pass the test, and this test is a prerequisite for promotion, and therefore more whites are promoted than blacks. Much more whites, many, many, many more whites are promoted than blacks. And this is a respectable test. It wasn't perceived as the test was a way in which Duke Power was going to discriminate. The justice's view was Duke Power was not trying to discriminate. But the result was that blacks in management were underrepresented at Duke Power as compared to the percentage of the black population in North Carolina. And this is disparate impact. So this test had an impact of creating a disparity in its outcome between the outcome and between the relative percentages in the population more generally. And so, so the justice says, the test is okay, but do the job qualifications really need this test? And the reality is that this test is winnowing the workforce along racial lines. And they made the assessment. It's kind of interesting. The court would make this assessment. They made the assessment that the company didn't really need this test in order to vet higher level employees. Right? So the court here is not running businesses or telling businesses how to run themselves. So the justices voted unanimously, to disallow such tests. And I quote, notwithstanding the employer's lack of discriminatory intent. So this is really bad law. So you could be convicted of discrimination without having discriminatory intent, without intending discrimination. And that makes the law arbitrary. Well, how do you decide if discrimination is, what does it even mean to discriminate if I didn't intend to discriminate? Every court had to perform a three-part, by the way, this is from a Free Press article that brings up this issue, a really good article. So each court has to perform a three-part judicial test to figure out whether any given hire was illegal under Griggs, and not just hire, any management practice. And what are the three decisions? They had to find out whether this was bad for blacks or a minority, then whether the qualifications it measured were job-related. So is the test or the business procedure or whatever, the business practice, is it job-related? And whether there were alternatives, were there other ways of getting the same result, achieving the business practice. So judges were in a position now to decide business practices and whether they were good and job-related and so on. So they were placing themselves in the position of a business leader, which they have no qualifications to make, no qualifications to decide. But they're now in the business, right, of business. And they couldn't decide these things. So basically, and businesses, of course, companies, of course, were really worried about lawsuits. So they were worried about any business hiring could lead to a lawsuit. So what the businesses engaged in, voluntarily, right, was to set quotas for minorities that were roughly equal to the percentage of the minority in the local population to offset, to in a sense, kind of prevent a lawsuit from even happening. The other way was to set criteria that were strictly based on credentials. Not on qualifications, but on credentials. Credentials being perceived by the courts as being something objective, right? So you can no longer safely give a break to a talented person and who might have gotten bad grades in high school or college, but still talented, because then that could skew the racial makeup of your workforce. So you could only do it if that person was a minority, and you could instead of that just go by credentials alone, and then you could make an exception. Couldn't hire by word of mouth. You couldn't generally engage in the hiring practices that people have engaged in for a very, very, very long time. Now, through the decades, disparate income impact doctrine spread from one area of American life to another. The campaign against redlining in 1994, where there was no redlining, assumed there was systemic racism going on. Why? Because whites were getting more mortgages than blacks. They couldn't prove discrimination because there might have been economic reasons to give or credit risk reasons to give in any particular area more mortgages to whites than blacks. But because the outcome was inconsistent with, the idea that everybody should be represented the same as they were represented in the population, banks were then, forced into creating all kinds of the Community Reinvestment Act, all kinds of ways in which they could compensate for the fact that they were disproportionately harming minority populations. So creditworthiness was ignored as an explanation for the disparity. All that you want is the result. And if the result means more whites are getting than blacks or more whites are getting than Hispanics, then the outcome, the impact, is discriminatory, viewed as discriminatory, whether the intention was to discriminate or not. Again, intention doesn't matter. Now, even though even the New York Times at the time completely debunked the whole idea of redlining, it didn't matter. This disparate impact, the outcome-based, which is really, if you think about it, it's just egalitarianism. It's another form of egalitarianism, right? We want the outcome to be the same, the outcome to be equal. Now, you could argue that the consequence of this played all the way out even into the 2008 financial crisis, the whole anti-redlining perspective. And you can see how this filtered into every aspect of police hiring and into business, into banking. In every aspect, your actions were determined to be legit or not based on whether the outcome was the same across racial groups, which is basically racism. And you had to correct that by, in a sense, setting kind of quotas. Well, the 10% of blacks in the population, we need to make sure that 10% of the mortgages are given to blacks. Now, more broadly, what this really led to was the whole equity movement. The whole movement that said, well, this just proves that there's systemic racism in America because the outcomes of America are not equal. Blacks represent X percent of the population, but they don't have that percent of the wealth. So they must be being discriminated against. The outcome has to be equality. So blacks as a population, again, collectivism, but blacks as a population need to have exactly the same characteristics in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of income, as whites. This became the thrust of, if you remember, Ibram Kendi's whole campaign, so-called anti-racism campaign. They turned the disparate income, this narrow feature, into this universal principle of egalitarianism, of equality, of outcome. And it doesn't matter, for example, if you are a racist. It doesn't matter if you intend to be racist. If the outcome is unequal, then there has to be racism there. One race is being preferred to another, therefore it has to be motivated by racism. If you remember the BLM days, this is exactly the argument, the exact argument. And then the consequence of that is, in order to cure us of this systemic racism, of this implicit racism, we have to take into account race in order to undo the consequences of this embedded, systemic, implicit, unconscious racism that exists in our culture. And he wrote this. So, for example, this is Kendi in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. The only remedy to racist discrimination and anti-racist discrimination, right? And this is the real anti-racist discrimination. So being an anti-racist is discriminatory in and of itself because you're denying the fact that you are racist. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That is what some people call reverse racism. So this is the consequence of this legal doctrine of disparate outcome that came down from Grigg versus Duke. Now, this executive order is trying to combat that and trying to reverse that. But you know, and it's going to filter through the system. How you know, how much impact it's going to have, it's hard to tell. But it does seem like companies, and I think the courts, are going to take a different look at disparate income, disparate impact. Now, there's some complications because in 1991, there was a bill passed under George H.W. Bush called the Civil Rights Act of 1991, which introduced disparate income into the letter of the law. To really get rid of disparate income, you would have to get rid of that law. You would have to have legislation to reverse that, and it doesn't seem like Republicans or Democrats have any appetite for doing that. But it is good that the executive branch is at least not going to use these kind of arguments when for the Justice Department to sue, for the Justice Department to go after people. This is going to be, the executive order basically tells the Justice Department not to take these kind of considerations into account. And that is good. To get completely rid of it in all sectors and throughout the economy, throughout our lives, you would have to reverse the 1991 Civil Rights Act. So on these cultural issues, on these issues of, you could call it the abuse of the civil rights law, although the civil rights law, because it prohibits private discrimination, creates these flaws built in, and affirmative action and this disparate income are just impacted just ways of applying the law, flawed ways of applying the law. But but on this issue, it seems like the Trump administration, or people in the Trump administration, I don't think Trump knows what disparate income is, but the people in the Trump administration that figured out a strategy based on the work of people like Richard Hanania and others of how to try to start unwinding the effects of the civil rights law on DEI. I mean, this is just another pillar of DEI, which is equity. This is the equity piece. And affirmative action was a diversity piece. And they're related and they're kind of the same, but the equity piece has kind of a moral component to it, and an explicit egalitarianism to it. And so by going after affirmative action, going after disparate impact, they're trying to attack DEI at its source, at its core, at its beginning. And for that, they should be commended. It's sad that it's coming from as ugly as an administration as the Trump administration, and ultimately a lot of this stuff could be undone by future administrations because it's all happening by executive order. But again, this is good stuff, and we should recognize positive movements when they happen. It's the kind of stuff I think that Larry Salzman in the interview last Saturday was talking about with regard to administrative law, with regard to the law of the regulatory bodies. It's the same kind of thing applied to now the Civil Rights Act and the DEI, the whole DEI phenomena. They're trying to go to the core of it, to the heart of it, and trying to dismantle the whole structure of it. And again, as such, that is a positive, that is a good thing.